Thank you, Vedan. Good morning, everyone. We're now live.
Welcome to this our fourth webinar, which is titled Down with Corruption, but it is also a tribute to Paddy Kearney. Before we start, can we just take a moment to say a silent prayer, meditate, or think about all those who have lost their lives and of all the loved ones who remain behind? In our silence, let us also bring to mind our deeply wounded country and our people. Remember also the victims of nuclear tests as we observe today International Day against nuclear tests. So let's observe just a few seconds of silence. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome once again to our eminent panelists and to the participants. This is our fourth webinar. We are faced with the option of mastering technology or gravitating towards nothingness. To be inclusive, we have included sign language in this webinar, but we are learning, so forgive us if there are any mistakes. Our first webinar explored decision making in a time of crisis, looking at the COVID-19 pandemic and the need for broad-based consultation, as well as information and education in decision making. The second webinar dealt with the debt burden faced by African countries and the important question of the debt owed to African countries for the years of exploitation of both its people and its resources. The third webinar was on gender-based violence, with particular reference to the early childhood development sector. We explored the need for greater investment in the sector because research indicates the absolute importance of training and learning during this period that has a lasting effect on the values an individual will cherish and carry throughout his or her life. There is a close interconnectivity in all these topics. This discussion today is taking place at a critical time um, in our country. Gandhiji's advice on how to make a decision was, and I quote, if you are ever in doubt, bring before your eyes the face of the poorest man you have seen and ask yourself if what you are about to do will benefit him or her. We ask how can what is happening in our country at present ever be in the interest of the poorest of the poor in our country? Paddy Kearney was chairman of the Gandhi Development Trust, and today we celebrate his 78th birth anniversary. The GDT vision and mission, which he helped to conceptualize, is, and I quote, to create a peaceful, just, and nonviolent world through building a culture of universal values. Let us focus on how we can help to build on the broad-based unity among like-minded people in order to chart out a program of action to ensure that we win back our country from the grip of corruption, crime, and violence. We will now watch a short video on Paddy Kearney.
now in South Africa, and that we needed to keep alive the legacy of Mahatma Gandhi and spread those ideas, because the ideas islands were obviously very, very important, especially here in KwaZulu-Natal, because even after the elections, the violence continued. And so there was a great need to help people to see that there is an alternative to violence. I think one of the things I find most exciting about those 15 years is how we have reached people of all ages. In those award ceremonies, obviously we were reaching people who are quite elderly, but there were many people who were young and middle-aged, and so we reached a very wide grouping. And we had two types of award. The one was the International Peace Award, often for people from outside South Africa, but also for some South Africans. And then the Satyagraha Awards, which were very much more for the local community and people who had taken a very active part in the ending of apartheid. Powerful things we're doing now is the early childhood education. There have been these discoveries through research that is a time of huge intellectual development in small children. They say like the first 3 years are almost more important than any other time of your education. So we're devoting a lot of attention to that. And that is really booming, the interest in that and the desire of many, many communities to have that type of education brought to them. And also for parents now. Parents are clamoring to learn how they can educate their children in good values. International Center of Nonviolence. It's an offshoot, actually, of the Gandhi Development Trust. It was an idea very much of ELA's, that in the universities in particular, but also in high schools, that nonviolence should be taught actively to young people. And it's taken a long time to get off the ground, but now I think it is really coming off the ground at the Durban University of Technology, where Crispin Hempson is the director of ICON and has developed a module which every student has to go through. When they come through the university, they have to have that course, and it's a course about nonviolence and about the values of the democratic values in a society like this. Many people in the corporate sector should be very supportive of this. They're very worried about the violence they see. They're very worried about the kind of instability, economic instability in this country. I think they would do well to support the efforts of the Gandhi Development Trust.
Selwyn, could you put my video back on? Thank you very much for that. What heartfelt words from Paddy Kearney, who was one of the founding members of the Gandhi Development Trust. Paddy was also a man who lived without division between his words and deeds. He did not only speak about nonviolence and social justice, but also put them into action in his day-to-day life. He was deeply disturbed at the level of corruption in our country. How troubled he would be now to see that in the middle of a pandemic such as this, greed surfaces once again and takes control of people. People who have the obligation to protect and care for the most vulnerable and those at risk. Today, we have a lineup of 6 speakers who will help us look at this complex problem from a range of perspectives. At the end of the speeches, we will have at least 45 minutes for discussion. We would also like to move from words to action. So please think about what you can do, what GDT and other civil society organizations can
Is there a
do
place where at least
and
I
what
can?
we should call on governments to do. I now have the pleasure of calling upon the executive director of the Amit Kathrada Foundation to share his insights. Welcome, Nishan Bolton. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, and greetings to everybody here. Thanks to Ila Ben and everybody else who have made this particular webinar possible. And greetings from the Kathrada Foundation. We refuse to allow corruption to destroy South Africa. And as you say, now is the time to act.
Which is your Wi-Fi on? Yeah.
Please,
Yeah, but it's not connected.
Geetha, can
Wi-Fi.
people please mute yourselves and put your videos off while the speakers are speaking? Selvin, can you do that?
I have done that. I'm just sorry, sorry everybody for that. Go
Thank
ahead,
you.
Nish.
Please go ahead.
No, there comes a time when the moral depravity of some in positions of authority, and both in government and the private sector, undermine the very notion of nationhood and the underlying values of public service. After years of state capture and unethical governance, and more recently, large-scale looting of COVID-19 emergency funding, the time is upon us to act. We are compelled to assert this is not how we shall be known as a nation, and we must refuse to allow corrupt networks in different provinces to go about their criminal activity and thereby trampling on the rights of honest and law-abiding people. This was the opening section of a call made by the Council of Churches, the Kathrada Foundation, the Desmond and Leah Tutu Foundation, the Nelson Mandela Foundation, the Foundation for Human Rights, and KSEC. In it, there was a call for all who live in South Africa to act against corruption. The Kathrada Foundation hosted on what was Amit Kathrada's 95th birth anniversary, a virtual online rally to mark his legacy of ethical, honest, and accountable leadership. In it, from that rally, we envisage a range of initiatives which will encourage members of the public, trade unions, businesses, the faith sector, and civil society and community organizations to demonstrate their anger over the large-scale looting of COVID-19 funds by politically connected elites. Our call is one that seeks to put power back in the hands of the public, to demand transparency and accountability from government. It is us ordinary South Africans who have entrusted government to look after our money and to use it wisely and prudently to benefit society. We want government to know that we will not sit idly by watching as greedy business COVIDpreneurs, politicians, and public servants steal money that is meant to save lives during the pandemic and to look after the poor and the vulnerable. The theft of COVID-19 funds puts lives in danger. We wanted to know from government who's getting the contracts for PPE equipment and what price, and we are happy to say that that particular call has been adhered to, although not yet adequate. We are beginning to see some of that information being made public. But what it does point to is that there's a need for the complete overhaul of government's procurement system to ensure transparency and better detection, accountability, and enforcement mechanisms for misconduct. We are also demanding that law enforcement agencies investigate, recoup the money, and prosecute those in the public and private sector involved in COVID-19 corruption. We want to see COVID-19 looters in orange overalls. And we want to see this before the 9th of December, because that's the day that the world will mark International Anti-Corruption Day. These were the calls made by that collective as well. So some of the things that are going to be underway is a campaign for calling on people across this country to, on Fridays, wear orange masks as a sign of support for this campaign and as a sign for support for people to be prosecuted where they are found guilty and for them to be seen behind bars in orange overalls. The campaign will also seek to enhance the status of whistleblowers in this country so that it is seen as national duty and national service to blow the whistle on corruption by public servants and those in the private sector as well. We have already seen a series of community pickets across the country. This will begin to pick up, and it's something that we would want to be seeing in almost every neighborhood and street across this country as we build up towards Heritage Day. And we think Heritage Day 2020 must begin to start a new discussion on what our heritage not has been, but what it needs to be. And we need to start building a heritage of integrity and ethical service. COSATU has already indicated that the 7th of October is when it intends to stage a national protest around the issue of corruption. And when once details of that are clear, we would begin to encourage wider civil society to consider joining as well. So these are steps that we have taken. And I'm sure that the Gandhi Development Trust and other organizations with whom is associated will begin to find ways of expressing their own concern and anger. What I do like in the last week or so is the range of discussions happening across the country on the issue of corruption. I don't think that that there should be limits. We need to be talking about this every day in every possible forum and every possible opportunity. So once more, this initiative here is I think, adds to that kind of value in terms of deepening understanding and making our voices louder about a problem that we are all concerned about. Archbishop Tutu warned in 1998, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. We so easily jettison the ideals we had when we were struggling. It is important that we retain the vigor of our civil society organs that were part of the struggle. We've got to retain the same capacity to smell out corruption, the abuse of power. And if they, that is government, are the true democrats, which we hope they are, they will say these are in fact our true friends, the ones who tell us when things are not right. And that is what we did when we met with the ANC this past Monday. That collective conveyed that particular message very loud and clear. So our call is, let us close ranks and unmask those from within the public and private sector who appear to want to serve society, but who have nothing but their own interest at heart. Let there be consequences for the corrupt, and let us recover what rightfully belongs to the people. Thanks, Ila Ben. Thanks, everybody, for making this possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nishan. We definitely have, with this depravity, stooped to a new low. I have to agree with you on that. Thank you so much for those strong, profound, and clear insights. And we definitely have to stand together as civil society to confront this very old enemy. Over to you, Mom.
Thank you, Nishan. When tackling a problem as complex and deep-rooted as corruption, it is important to understand how it manifests and how endemic it really is. So going beyond anecdotes and stories, I have the pleasure of calling on the CEO of the Human Sciences Research Council, Professor Kraim Soedien. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ella, and thank you very much for inviting me to this occasion. Thank you to you, Asha, too. So, colleagues, talking to what the problem is here in front of us, I have to begin by making it very clear that unfortunately we do not have absolutely verifiable statistics of the scale of the problem that we are confronting with corruption. We don't have statistics in the same kind of vein or level of scientific accuracy as we may, for example, talk about the COVID-19 levels of infections. I cannot say to you that corruption inside of the country right now stands at a categorical level of such and such and such. We do, however, have proxy statistics. We do also have reports which we have to assemble and put together. Ella used the word anecdotal evidence. We do have a lot of anecdotal evidence of what is going on. Just very recently, over the past 2 years, 2 books were published, which give us a sense of the complexity of the problem that we have. The first book actually was by Jacques Pau. And this Jacques Pau book was very controversial at the time, but it gave us a deep insight into what was happening. And then came Crispin Olber's book about what was happening in Mandela Bay. And the books are now coming. We also had a big report which was put together by some academics in 2018, which also attempted to detail what was going on. But what I'd like to share with you are those statistics that we have, which come from organizations like Corruption Watch and Transparency International. And so, Sullivan, can we start with the presentation, please? So, Transparency International is a global corruption observatory, if you like. And it's tried to collect statistics for 180 countries globally, and it's developed measures, instruments for reflecting the state of corruption inside of these countries. As you can see on the slide here, the indicator for corruption begins with 0, which is a country which is highly corrupt, and 100, which is clean. For the 43 countries that participated in this index, the average was 43. So the average is below 50%. So you can see already that globally we've come to a point where corruption is fairly normalized, and that must be, for all of us, a very concerning feature of our daily lives everywhere in the world. That it is part of our social practice should be something that I would like, Ella, I hope that we should be taking the opportunity in this webinar to talk about. Next slide, please, Sylvan. So what does South Africa look like in terms of this Transparency International rating? It indicates here that South Africa in 2019, when this assessment with this evaluation was done here for South Africa, which goes to survey members of the public, it indicated that for South Africa, 64% of our population thought in 2019 that corruption was on the increase. The significance of that is that significantly more than half of our population have a level of mistrust in what the state of corruption is inside of the country. Next slide, please, Sullivan. In terms of these international indicators, South Africa is ranked 70th out of the 180 countries, and has a score out of that 100 of 44. I've mentioned before that 64% in the barometer think that corruption increased in the previous 12 months. We also have, coming out of that barometer, the report that, and this is in relation to people disclosing in these surveys, that 18% of them paid bribes in the previous 12 months. Now, I think that that's a fairly accurate indication of what is happening, because in the survey, there was clearly no self-interest in the ways in which people were reporting, and there would be no inclination for people to want to disguise what they were going through. Next slide, please. So this slide gives you a sense of what's been happening around these indices, these perception indices inside of the country for since 2012. And you can see there that in terms of public perceptions, our ranking is fairly stable. Now, that's neither a good or a bad thing, but it gives you an indication just of these levels, as I say, of mistrust inside of the country. We began in 2012 with a ranking of a score of 43, and we end up in 2019 with a score of 44. Our ranking remains also roughly in that 70 out of 180 area. Next one, please, Sylvie. Now, these are our reports that come from a PricewaterhouseCoopers 2020 global survey. And the survey they did of South Africa is very revealing. In 2018, just look at the bottom set of bars there. Asset misappropriation was the highest identified form of corruption in South Africa, 49%, at 49%. Significantly, and why this is so, I think we still need to understand, asset misappropriation dropped to 23% in 2019. But really notable are those areas in which rises are being identified in forms of corruption. And they're most prevalent in what we might call economic crime. Customer fraud has come to the fore as the most prominent form of economic crime, followed by bribery and corruption and financial statement fraud. So it's noticeable that while incidences of most fraud types declined in South Africa, occurrences of the top three rose, as did cybercrime, which seems to be creeping up to levels that were previously recorded. Concerning is the increase in financial statement fraud, because this is involving, and this is very concerning, senior management in our corporations and in the public sector, and the amounts are really quite significant. Next slide, please, Selvin. This slide here is from Corruption Watch, and I looked at the annual reports for Corruption Watch for the last few years, and I would like to encourage all of you colleagues to go and look at them. They're very revealing. They take a particular theme every year, and so this theme here is on whistleblowers for 2019. and it gives you a sense of how people with, you'd like to hope, because there always are stories around whistleblowers about why they are doing this, but gives you a sense of what people with stories to tell about what's going on inside of their organizations are saying. And you can see there that hotspots for these reports are coming from sectors of our society which we would like to think ought to be models of ethical behavior. The highest number of whistleblower reports are coming from the police sector. Now that should be a cause of great alarm for all of us. 10% of the reports that came in from police. The second highest was for schools, and you're talking here about SGBs in the main, principals, people who have access to and control over decision-making functions inside of educational institutions. The third one was mining, and that's really interesting, given how significant mining continues to be as a sector in South Africa. And then traffic and licensing, and you ought to put this together with policing. And as I say, these are really concerning areas for all of us. Health care follows, and lastly, housing. Next slide, please, Sylvan. The next slide also comes from Corruption Watch, and it gives you a sense of where the hotspots for forms of corruption which are being reported are being most evident and most prominent. And you might expect this. So Gauteng is the hotspot for corruption in South Africa. 47% of the reports in the country come from Gauteng, followed by KZN with 10% and Limpopo with 9%. The top three transgressions reported were bribery, procurement fraud, and mismanagement of funds. Next slide, please, Sylvan. This next slide comes from National Prosecuting Authority convictions. And they don't seem significant, but I think that this is really just the tip of the iceberg, largely because of the difficulty with which we have of bringing complaints to this kind of level. 7 people were convicted of corruption or activities relating to corruption where more than 5 million rand was involved. This was for 2019. The number of government officials convicted of corruption or offences related to corruption were 152. In the private sector, the number was 189. And I think that these are undercounts. The numbers, I think, are clearly much higher than this. Next slide, please, Sylvan. This is the last slide, but one, colleagues, and it's from our Auditor General, Kimi Makwetu. And he makes the comment, he says that the safe and clean hands that can be relied upon to look after the public's finances in local government are few and far between. That's in his 2020 audit outcomes report for local government. And just look at the next slide, please. Give you a sense of what it is. Next one, please, Sullivan. What it is that we are having to deal with. So 257 municipalities and 21 municipal entities were audited in the 2018-2019 report. And these are the outcomes. Only 8% had clean audits. That's absolutely astonishing. Only 9% had no findings, but they had compliance with legislation issues. The rest were audits with with qualifications, and we clearly have a major problem here. It's reflected in this figure here for irregular expenditure. An irregular expenditure in the country in that last reporting year was 32.6 billion. The last figure, graph there, not graph, figure with that cart there gives you a sense of the worth of contracts which could not be audited due to missing or incomplete information. And so this is a really revealing slide, colleagues. What I didn't include in the slide is the large number of municipalities and metros which couldn't be audited. They number something like 20, more than 20, that couldn't be audited because their accounts were in such disarray that they were unable to properly report. But this is what we are able to draw on and to gather from the public record, colleagues. As I said at the beginning here, we're unable to tell you in forensic and clinical terms what the actual situation is. But just on the measure of what I've said to you, we clearly have problems. And the scale of our problems, I think, are such that all of us need to be deeply concerned for what is going on. Thanks very much, Ella. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. Sidin. Yes, indeed, we have to take this discussion forward. 32.6 billion. It's mind-boggling. We asked for a deep analysis, and that is what you have provided us. Your contribution has helped us to understand the problem more deeply and lays a very good foundation from which we can begin to think about how we tackle this problem.
Thank you so much, Prof. Before we go to the next speaker, just to let you all know that we're live streaming on Facebook and we've had a few comments. Kanya Kumari Padyachi asked that we call out corruption in any shape and form, whether it's among our families or friends. And Saren Padyachi adds that he agrees with that, and especially it should be called out in our business circles. And Devon Kublal emphasized that each one of us really has to do something, has an obligation to do something against corruption. So I think we are all keenly aware that corruption affects all of us in society, but its impact is most deeply felt on the poor. To help us understand this facet of corruption more deeply, we are very fortunate to have Mashudu Masuta, a lawyer from Corruption Watch, with us. Mashudu, you have the floor.
Morning to everyone, and thank you so much for inviting us to this very important dialogue. I think Prof really set the scene of where we are in terms of corruption and South Africa's corruption, and it really is a privilege for me to be speaking about the socioeconomic effects of corruption on the poor. I think I'll just flag two important concepts when we talk about corruption, and I'll try as much as possible to be brief and stick to the time frame. The first is the way that we define corruption. So our organization, Corruption Watch, defines corruption as the abuse of public power and public resources for private gain. And by that definition, we then come to the conclusion that corruption affects us all. It threatens sustainable economic development, ethical values, and justice. It destabilizes our society and endangers the rule of law. It undermines the institutions and values of our democracy, because public policies and public resources are beneficial to the poor, it is most harmful to the poorest of the poor. They are the ones that get the direct effect of that abuse. The poor to be dependent on government for housing, healthcare, education, security, and welfare makes the poor most vulnerable to corruption since it stalls delivery. From our research at Corruption Watch and as put by Prof, some of the hotspots are mentioned in those areas. So those key areas are the areas in which the poor are most dependent on government. We regularly see either on social media or through news headlines delays in infrastructure development, poor building quality, and layers of additional costs are all consequences of corruption, which deprive our citizens of their constitutional and human rights. It's important to also understand the broader picture of corruption in terms of economic terms. So, the economic implications of corruption. Corruption and international perceptions of corruption in South Africa has been damaging to the country's reputation and has created obstacles to local and foreign direct investment, flows to stock market, global competitiveness, economic growth, and ultimately distorted the development and upliftment of our people. Public money is for government services and projects. So the tax collected, bonds issued, income from government investment, and other means of financing government expenditure are meant for social grants, education, hospitals, roads, the supply of power and water to ensure personal security of our citizens. The corruption and bad management eat at the nation's wealth, channeling money away from these projects, and the very people who are most dependent on government for support no longer receive them. There's been countless studies around the world by civil society organizations, local and abroad, including from private sector and from government departments, which show how corruption can interrupt investment, restrict trade, reduce economic growth, and distort the facts and figures associated with government expenditure. But the most alarming of these studies are the ones that directly link corruption to the increasing levels of poverty and income inequality, which is something that is so common and that we know of here in South Africa. Which then directs me to point to another very important concept, which is the difference between equity and equality when we're speaking about the socioeconomic impacts of corruption. I want us to take a minute to try and visualize three images. The one image is of three young boys. One is 17, one is 7, and one is 3. All three of these boys want to watch a soccer game, but they want to watch a soccer game from behind a wall. Now, equality will say that for these three boys, they must be given the same support mechanisms in order for them to watch the soccer game. So the 17-year-old will be given a box, same length, same diameter to stand on to watch the game over the wall. Same with the 7-year-old and same with the 3-year-old. However, with this equality, can all three boys look at watch the soccer game over the wall with the same support mechanisms? That's one way of addressing the socioeconomic effects. The second image I would like you to visualize is the same three boys, 17, 7, and 3, given equitable support mechanisms in order for them to watch the soccer game. That means you look at the individual needs and the characteristics of all three boys independent of each other to enable them to watch the soccer game over the wall. So you possibly give the 3-year-old 2 boxes instead of 1, so they'll be able to look over the wall. You give the 7-year-old possibly 1 box in order for them to look over the wall. And the 17-year-old can already look over the wall and does not need the same kind of support. That is equitable addressing of that socioeconomic effect. But South Africa for a long time, and particularly during this COVID-19 pandemic, has struggled to deal with the wall, which represents the systematic issues of socioeconomic issues. If you deal with the wall, address the wall, you manage a lot of the cost implications, as well as the troubles of trying to ensure that the support mechanisms are there for each individual. There's never been an addressing of the systematic issues. The systematic issues of racism, gender-based violence, femicides, all these issues are this the sides of the same coin when we're speaking about corruption. And that's what we're moving towards. As Corruption Watch, we're advocating for good governance that also deals with the systematic issues that exist in South Africa. Then we have a situation where there isn't a need for these support mechanisms, but the ability for all of us to freely watch the soccer game. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mashudu. What a beautiful analogy. Let us begin to deal with the wall finally. You have really brought home the fact that we should never get used to corruption and end up living with it, because it has life and death consequences for poor people. Your contribution actually reminded me again of Gandhiji, when he asked us to think about the impact that our choices would have on the poorest and the weakest in society. I wonder if those who offer bribes and those who accept bribes consider how their actions actually affect the poor and the weak. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Mashudu. Yesterday, someone said to me that all of these ideas about tackling corruption are nonsense because it is so deeply rooted within society. How can we address a social evil of this magnitude without the guidance of a faith-based perspective? To help us look at corruption and its underlying driver, greed, we are honored to have Father Makechwa. Over to you, Father. Father Makechwa, can you unmute? Hello? I can see Father Makechwa here. Selva?
Okay, I'm trying to assist with unmuting him. Just give us a few minutes, a few seconds rather.
Okay. Father Makechwa is also heading up the moral regeneration movement in the country. And so I'm sure he'd be able to guide us. Father Makechwa? Father Makechwa, you need to unmute. We can't hear you. Selvin?
While we're trying to get Father Makachwa online, shall we move on to Juanita, and we'll bring Father Makachwa online after Juanita.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are not unique in our experience of corruption in South Africa. We are part of a world system where corruption is actually quite deep rooted. And some have succeeded in addressing it. to place everything that we talked about so far within an international context. We have Juanita Olaya, who's an international expert in this field. We are really delighted that you are here today to share your experience and expertise. So thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Asha. Thank you so much, Ms. Gandhi, for the invitation. It's a delight and a pleasure for me to be participating today in your webinar. And I hope to contribute with also some ideas. In listening to the previous presenters, I was surprised how much our words connect. So you will see my contribution and my words connecting very much to to all of what you have said, which I agree so much. I've been spending a lot of my life working in the field directly with addressing corruption, addressing change, and the way I like to see it today, much more
They
is
can't
about
hear me.
promoting
I'm
integrity.
supposed to be speaking now, but they can't hear me. How do I? My name is here. So how do I?
Sorry, Juanita.
Sorry
Let's
about the
Don't
technical
worry.
mute
difficulties.
everybody.
I'm
Don't
going
worry.
to mute.
Don't worry. This is what happens with this. If you want to, we can swap again with Father if he's really available now.
No, it's fine.
Okay.
No,
It's
no,
fine.
go ahead.
Okay. And don't worry. These are the kinds of things we have to be patient about these days with these webinars. Don't worry. So what I was saying is I would like to share a bit of my perspective and the things I've learned from working in the field on the ground, which connect very much to what has been also said already. One basic thing is, again, as Mrs. Masuda emphasizes, corruption really is an issue about overlapping a private interest over the public interest. So in reality, it's an issue that concerns all and that affects everybody. From this standpoint, one thing that we've learned in addressing it is that there's definitely not a single solution, because the problem is systemic. It's a system, and not just in South Africa, but all over the world. And in each town, in each township, in every smaller system of that bigger system. So it's not really something that is specific or particular to a certain area of the world, unfortunately. So we do see what also Mr. Sudin was showing, that in a way corruption is normalized. In a way, corruption is part of, unfortunately, a part of human behavior nowadays, and it's better for us to realize it is that way, to be able to address it properly. This also has another consequence, which means we need to, or my invitation would be for us to stop seeing corruption as a binary issue, of an issue between corrupt and not corrupt people, between good and bad, because we are all, as human beings, in a way, subject to the temptation or the possibility of at some point taking a wrong decision and making the wrong choices. Because precisely of these social norms, and because precisely it has become a normalized issue. So I think it is important to think about how to create environments for integrity that enable the majority of us to take decisions better, to think more about the public interest and less about the private one. And in this sense, I feel that while sanctions and controls are necessary and have been a necessary tool in addressing corruption, we need to move more and more into making an effort to create environments for integrity, environments that foster integrity. And this is actually the wall. The wall, I see it as the wall that Masuda was mentioning. We need to enable more and more people to think in terms of this public interest, to behave in terms of this public interest, and give these people also a chance. Because otherwise, if we generalize corruption also, if we talk about corruption as a generalized issue, then we're only creating solutions to lock up a whole society, and that's also not a good alternative, I think. It is also very important to think in terms of creating conditions for integrity, including supporting integrity behavior, rewarding integrity behavior, and not just sanctioning and controlling it, which is also a feature that we sometimes forget. And it's also an issue or an area where civil society can play and is playing a very important role. Because sometimes it's hard to do the right thing. It's hard to take the right decision. It's hard to blow the whistle. These people need protection as well, and reward and visibility, and to realize that it really pays off to behave that way. In line of what has been said before, I think one of the biggest shortbacks of our current fight against corruption globally is that we're forgetting the victims. In fighting against corruption, we're terribly focused on the perpetrators and on the causes and on the symptoms, but we're leaving the consequences of corruption there, standing there. And precisely, as you've said before, those most affected by it, the poorest people, the most vulnerable populations who remain affected by corruption. If we had a pipe and the pipe was leaking, we would address that leakage first, and then try to find out how the pipe broke. And this is what I mean by addressing the consequences of corruption. I think we need to start putting more emphasis and more focus on repairing that damage as well, while of course as attending the causes and addressing the system and creating a system of integrity. But we also need to immediately start repairing the damage that has been caused without waiting for the responsibilities or those responsible to be brought to justice. And what this means is delivering the services that are not being delivered, attending to the damage caused to society in terms of the trust lost, the hope lost, the conflict raised, that these scenarios of corruption are causing. There's increasing experience all over the world in starting to explicitly repair that damage, both within cases of corruption brought to justice, where civil society also pleads for reparation for the collective damage, not the individual damage, but the collective damage to society that corruption has been caused. We have cases, for example, in Costa Rica, where a bribery case involving a foreign company this company ended up paying the sanctions, etc., but also issuing a reparation to the Costa Rican society. And we have more and more enforcement officials thinking about that reparation, but it is also something that civil society could raise their voices to and their actions to. I am delighted also to see the presentations and the participation to this webinar, because corruption is an interconnected issue. Corruption is not an issue in itself. Corruption contributes to other problems and is part of other problems and is good. And I welcome very much that it is here also seen that way, that is connected to human rights issues. Corruption violates human rights. Corruption keeps people from the enjoyment of the rights that belong to them. So it's important to work also on the emphasis of these connections. Corruption also affects the type of work we need to be doing to stop the consequences of climate change that we've also created ourselves, and poverty and inequality. So we need to see all this connected. And this is why, and coming back to the definition of corruption, I would emphasize that we need to see and to expect and to demand that we measure our work against corruption against the direct improvement of the quality of life of people. if fighting corruption does not translate directly into the improvement of the quality of life of people, uh, we're doing something wrong. That should be our measure, and that should be our goal. That by fighting and fighting for against corruption, we will improve the quality of life of most people. I also want to come back to a topic mentioned by Mr. Suden at the beginning, the absolute importance of working at the local level. I think the local government level is where there is more hope and where there is more possibilities of working and achieving direct results, not only in improving the quality of life of people, but also in creating environments for integrity. There's many we can discuss at length, and I welcome also the conversation on that topic. But partly, I think the figures he shows on this, this 9% of municipalities only having implemented frameworks for control, etc., is a symptom, because we've been dealing with local governments as if they were little countries, and they're not. They are systems in themselves, as complex as countries could be. And they need also a systemic view, also a lot of specialized and targeted attention. Just like the 3 kids in Masuta's example, local municipalities need tailor-made approaches to fight corruption, to create environments for integrity. We've not been doing it that well. We're missing an important opportunity with local governments, and I think there is an important area of action and of work. Finally, on what to do, I think I am one of those people who believe that what to do starts very much with our own selves, walks through society, and connects also to institutions and organizations at all levels, just as you have mentioned also as well. And I would invite you wholeheartedly to continue this, and not only to stop at expressing outrage and concern, but actually on continuing and taking, in fact, action in changing the ground rules, in doing what you can within your areas of influence and of work. Sometimes things seem to be too overwhelming, too big to tackle, and we forget that we do have our closer circle of work, of strategies, of influence, of foundations, etc., where we do can insert an impact, and those impacts are really can carry on a wider impact. So I encourage as much action as possible. Thank you very much, and I would be also welcoming questions during the discussion.
Thank you so much, Juanita. That was it reminded me of something I read yesterday, actually, where the person said, sometimes we know exactly what we should do or say in a particular circumstance, but because of pressure, we fail to act, or we choose the easy way out. And we must be conscious of this challenge, that it is not always easy to choose the right path. Your presentation also reminded me of something that Gandhiji said, when he said that if one drop is dirty, it doesn't make the entire ocean dirty. So, it gives us some hope for humanity. I'm pleasantly surprised at that. Generally, in a corruption conversation, all that we see is the darkness of humanity. But you have demonstrated that there is light and dark, and I think that actually leads very, very nicely into our next speaker that will be introduced, that's going to talk more from a faith-based perspective. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you, Juanita, for that wonderful presentation. And I think, Father Makechua, you are unmuted now. Can you take the floor, Father Makechua? No, you have to unmute. We can't hear. Right. No, unmute again.
Sorry, Auntie Ela, I'm also trying to unmute him, but for some reason he's unable to. Let me try again from a technical point of view.
And the other thing that we're going to do is mute the current interpreter and give her a break, and Lindiwe is going to take over. Thank you very much, Keb.
Unmute yourself. Unmute.
Regrettably, I'm trying, but failing, and I think he's also got to unmute as well. I've tried unmuting him, but for some reason, I'm not able to unmute him.
Or computer self-unmute, do it.
There we go.
There we go.
Can you hear me
Great.
now?
Yes.
Honest, I'm so embarrassed. My profuse apologies.
No,
The screen simply just say you have been muted. That was the one problem. The second problem is that I'm using someone else's technology, and not always very familiar with that. But I'm terribly sorry. But also to the facilitators, let me make one point very clear, that what has just happened is not by design. I'm not trying to play the role of the Pope. There is what is called an ex cathedra pronouncement by the Pope, which means once the Pope has spoken, no one else is allowed to speak up. So that was not the intention at all. Right. On a much more serious note, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm really very humbled, but also I'm very, very excited to participate in a discussion, but also a reality that is of concern to everybody in this country. We're meeting at a time when South Africa is really reeling under the most despicable scandal since the advent of a democracy. Theft of the PPEs and the consequences of that action, which has given rise to, I think, a lot of anger in the country. It's not that people have not been aware of corruption before, but this particular one has an aspect to it which makes people very, very, very horrified and angry. It is inhuman. It is almost, it's really diabolical. And in Zulu, they would say such a person who committed such a crime, umtagat. You are a witch and you have no heart and you really deserve the greatest punishment ever. So this is the climate, the environment during which we are meeting. Just to also quote the WHO chief. This is one example of the various reactions from different people. This is what he says. He says any type of corruption, of course, is unacceptable. However, corruption related to PPEs is actually murder, because if health workers without PEE were risking their lives and that of the people they serve. So in other words, is blatant murder. Now, when most people talk about corruption in the main, they refer to those aspects of it that are visible, quantifiable, tangible. Because for most people, that is the easiest way of understanding it. They rely very much also on anecdotal evidence that is given by lots of people based on their own experience. Not many people appreciate the importance of analysis, social, especially social analysis, which helps you to understand the root causes of the challenge that is facing you. Not only just what you hear and see and feel, but the root causes and so on. Now, lots of people probably have almost given up on this problem. Not my business, and what can I do about it? That's the attitude, which is not always very helpful at all. Now, the argument of the moral regeneration movement is that corruption is not a congenital condition. People are not born corrupt, not even born good, but it is the system of socialization in the families, in our institutions of learning, in our social clubs, in our organized labor, organizations, workplaces, and sometimes, regrettably and embarrassingly,
You're muted again, Father. Unmute. Please unmute. Unmute, Father.
Apologies, ladies and gentlemen. We are trying to unmute him again.
Unmute. Unmute the. Yeah. Can't hear.
We can't hear you, Father Makachwa. Can you please unmute again?
I am
I
trying
think
from my side, so
Let him unmute.
okay.
Maybe he.
Father
Unmute.
Makachwa, we can't hear you. Can you please unmute? You've turned off your video now. You need to turn on the video and.
Okay, from the technical point of view, I am trying to get him to unmute and turn on his video. So please, apologies for the technical delays and.
We can see you now, Father, but we can't hear you.
Sincere apologies for all of this.
We can see you, Father, but we still can't hear you. Father, you're still on mute. No, you're still on mute. There should be a little mic, something that looks like a little mic that you need to tap. Okay, we see you, but we still can't hear you.
Yeah, from the technical point
yes,
of view,
now we all set. We all set, Father. Please,
okay.
please go ahead.
Let's
okay.
hope. Okay. Now, just to repeat what I said, the MRM's argument is that people learn to be corrupt because of the environment in which they grow up and in which they work, in which they entertain themselves. That's what happens and so on. Now, I want to suggest three, just in the interest of time, there's three possible root causes of this pathology, because that's what it is. The first is the ideology of materialism. This has eroded the ethical principles and especially the philosophy of Ubuntu. And it is closely related to conspicuous consumption. Money and material possessions are elevated to a status of a little god for which people will resort to dishonesty and even use violent means in order to sustain their corrupt lifestyle. Now, regrettably, we entered our democracy with some of us already entangled in the culture of corruption. This impacted negatively on our ambitious developmental state agenda as a country, as a people. Since the culture of materialism drives people to expensive lifestyles, they usually resort to corruption to keep their lifestyle alive. Now, on the same issue, Madiba had some very strong words to say, which I'm not going to quote in the interest of the time. The poison of materialism has even found its way in institutions that are normally regarded as custodians of moral and ethical integrity. Now, the second cause is the loss of the moral fiber of the nation, loss of spirituality, which prompted Madiba to call for the RDP of the soul as early as 1994. This can have devastating consequences for individual and society. Once people have lost the sense of right and wrong, acceptable and unacceptable ways of behavior, whether privately or in public, then everything goes, everything is allowed. The final cause I'm suggesting is lack of ethical leadership among those who occupy positions of responsibility. Now, whether or not they know it, many people in society look up to people in leadership as role models, especially young people, are particularly subject to that. What can we do to combat this? Perhaps we'll find time later to elaborate it, but let me just flag a few ideas. One, obviously we know government has its own plans, its strategies and everything else. Those we know very well. Now, from the perspective of civil society, I propose, one, that there should be a massive program of conscientization and mobilization. Now, conscientization is not only informing people, which of course is very important, but is also informing them in such a way that people want to act against that which is evil, that which is bad. That's really what conscientization, in my understanding, is all about. And it's also very important to bear in mind that to be successful, it's important that like-minded people, like-minded organizations and institutions should find a way to work together. Bolton will remember this one. The popular organs of people's power, that's what we used to call street committees during the days of the struggle against apartheid. For those who may not know, we used to organize, especially in townships, cities, into small groups of X number of families where residents in that particular area would come together almost weekly to compare notes, to exchange information, but also to deal with issues that were of concern to them, not only concerning apartheid, but issues just of bread and life, bread and butter issues and so on. And in the process, the question of security for everyone in the community was of paramount. And corruption was one of the challenges and enemies that we face. I would say we, because I can speak from experience. I was very much involved in that. So come 1994, unfortunately, we got so excited with this democracy, and most of this people's organs or people's power, those structures, people's structures disappeared. And that's why today there's very little leadership at a local level. And the kind of leadership that we have in the persons of councillors sometimes is problematic in the sense that they tend to politicize. What I'm talking about is something that that is open to everybody. It should not be politicized, otherwise it will not work. Now, let me conclude, Chair, by quoting what Thabo Mbeki said once in a conference on these issues. He says, we have to intensify the campaign for moral renewal, ensuring that we mobilize the masses of our people to engage in a sustainable struggle to expose and defeat corruption wherever and whenever it occurs. In this regard, it is important that we project the alternative value system that we want to replace the acquisitive and selfish one to which we are opposed. We cannot avoid pronouncing ourselves on the complex matter of what is right and wrong in a manner that is easily understood by the masses of the people. Unquote, and end of my contribution. I can deal with some of the other issues during question time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Father. Indeed, we are deeply grateful to you for this input. I think, as Pope Francis said, that we cannot stand by and watch whilst all this is happening around us. So yes, we will take up the challenge and start conscientizing and uniting society and setting up the structures once again. So thank you, Father, and thanks for reminding us to do that work. I also hope that the young people in this audience will take up that challenge. But let me also say that today, as we indicated earlier, is a day when we celebrate Paddy's life. And his life has truly been a testament that a transparent life is a life without moral ambiguities, in which heart, mind, and gut are united in choosing the light. This is what Paddy would have said. Thank you, Brother Raymond, for illuminating, or I would like to call on Brother Raymond to further illuminate Paddy's life for us today. Thank you so much for agreeing to come. You have the floor now, Brother Raymond.
Thank you very much, Ella, for inviting me to speak today, and thank you for arranging this really important event on the occasion of Paddy's what would have been Paddy's birthday. It's almost 2 years since Paddy Kearney left, and looking at the list of names of people attending today, I know many of you worked with him very closely, both in the time of the struggle, through organizations like Diaconia, have worked with him since liberation, through the active citizens movement, through the social cohesion activities, and also, of course, the Gandhi Development Trust. Some of you may know I'm the director of the Dennis Hurley Center, which in many ways was Paddy's last and final great achievement, establishing the center named after his great inspiration and his great mentor, Archbishop Dennis Hurley. Paddy was the founder and the chair of the center for its first 3 years of existence, and has left a very big gap behind since we lost him 2 years ago. Rather than you looking at me then, I wanted to actually share some images of Paddy. If Selvin, yeah, thank you very much. If you give me the sharing. And this is a lovely sequence of images of pictures of Paddy that was actually prepared for his memorial a few years ago by in fact Selvin and Kiru Naidu. And you may recognize yourselves in some of the pictures that are going up. As part of what I've been doing recently is researching a biography of Paddy Kearney. As you know, Paddy wrote the wonderful biography of Archbishop Hurley. You just saw a picture of it there. And Paddy occasionally would share with me stories about the old days, And I would tease him and say, but Paddy, you've written Hurley's biography. Surely you should write your own story as well. And Paddy, as we know, was incredibly modest and incredibly humble. And he would always say, no, 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 I couldn't possibly write down my story. And then I'd say, well, if you won't write it, then will you let me write it? And his exact words to me were, for as long as I'm alive, you can't write my biography. So perhaps rather sadly, after his death, his brother handed over to me his archive, and I've been working through that and trying to get some insight into Paddy. And I will be contacting quite a few of the names of the people I see here will be people I'll be contacting over the next few months to do further research and interviews. And if you feel you've got some insights into Paddy, then do please contact me via the Dennis Hurley Centre. I'd love to hear from you. So what really struck me in reflecting on today's subject and looking back at Paddy's life and Paddy's archive is the transition that he went through and the role that he then felt he had to play in taking other people through that transition. He, after all, grew up as a white man in South Africa in an environment where, as a white man, you had everything you needed, and you had no reason to care for everyone else who might be less advantaged, whether by gender or by race or any other aspect of their lives. And yet Paddy devoted himself to fighting for the oppressed, to fighting for those who were most disadvantaged, not only up till 1994 and liberation, but after 1994. And of course, the focus of the Dennis Hurley Centre is on those who continue to be marginalized in our society: homeless people, refugees, the urban unemployed, and so on. One of the questions I've been asking myself is, how did Paddy go through this transformation? And it's clear that what really touched him was a sense, and we've many of the speakers have referred to this, a sense of feeling the injustice that other people were suffering, and responding to that feeling of injustice with a combination of indignation, of righteous indignation, but not just an anger that caused him to shout out, but a motivation to act. So to see, judge, and act, not just to see and judge. And I think that might be one of the key things he would want to say to us during a conversation like this. Yes, we can see corruption, we see it all around us, and we see it in some of the statistics that are being presented. We can judge about who is being corrupt, what situations are corrupt, what kind of situations encourage corruption or enable corruption to happen. But unless we act, then we can do nothing about it. And one of the things which Paddy was very clear about is that we all have an opportunity to act in every situation we are in. It's not just the high and mighty. And in these photos, you will see cardinals and archbishops and people who've gone on to be leading political figures and leading figures around the world. But you'll also see ordinary members of the public. And Paddy was very clear that we all have an opportunity to act because we are all in situations where we can address the injustices we see around us. And so the conscientization which has been referred to is something that he went through, and then particularly through the early work of Diaconia, realized that he had to help other people along that journey. And I suppose one of the challenges he might put to us today is, how do we reach beyond the group of people who've gathered here today to those who really need to hear this message? Because the danger is, in all social justice work, that we are preaching to the converted, we are singing to the choir. I presume that by the very presence of people at this session today, we're all pretty committed to trying to root out corruption and are frustrated at the amount of corruption that there is in our society. The people who perhaps need to most address that are unlikely to be the ones who are attending seminars like this. And that, of course, is the people who are involved in corruption, quite clearly, but also those who turn a blind eye. And I think one thing which Paddy realized very clearly is that the struggle against apartheid and the struggle against racism in general and othering of people, whether because of race or nationality or gender, whatever reason, only gets addressed if all the people who are quiet, all the people who are neutral, all the people who are not engaged see what's going on and are aware of it and willing to speak out against it. And I think that's the big challenge which he clearly faced in his work in fighting against apartheid, and it's the challenge that we now face in fighting against corruption. And so the kind of dangers which have been pointed out, where corruption becomes normalized, where it's something that we all take for granted, it's something that we feel we can't do anything about, it's something that we feel is an inevitable part of South African society, the more that we fall into that trap, the less likely we are to be able to root it out. Just as all of those churches who felt, well, inequality is inevitable, racism is inevitable. Well, it's not really happening here, or it's not happening in our neighborhood, or well, we can't really do anything about where it is happening, so we'll just carry on in our own way. It was Paddy's work to hold a mirror up to those communities and help them see that they were responsible and that they could do something about it, and that in so doing, help others to speak out and to stand up. So all of these pictures of Paddy giving talks, speaking, running around the city and the province and the country, raising awareness of the issues that he was aware of and helping others to become aware of it. We need to do the same. We need to speak to those who are not engaged. We need to speak to those who are silent. We need to speak to those who have given up, who are shrugging their shoulders, who are saying, well, I can't do anything about it. It's always going to be there. And help them see, as some of the speakers have mentioned, the possibility that there is another way, that there is a world of values that we claim that we all believe in, that we can actually reclaim for South Africa and reclaim for our societies. And that if we don't, we may not be the ones who suffer, but those who most suffer are the poorest of the poor, those who are most likely to be to lose out on the services, to lose out on money that should be spent on their needs and what's required for them to live a good life, and instead get siphoned off in all kinds of really shocking, and I think the word diabolical was used earlier, and I would add to that, diabolical ways in which we steal from the poor and tolerate theft from the poor, because that's what we're doing when we tolerate corruption. So if Paddy was speaking to us from beyond the grave, I think he would want us to look seriously about what can we do to broaden the voice, to make sure that it's not just a small group of people, and I know many people around this table are already involved in that, particularly groups like the Active Citizens Movement and the Katrada Foundation. How do we make sure that these are the voices of ordinary people, ordinary wealthy people and ordinary poor people, speaking up and saying, enough is enough, we do not tolerate this, we did not tolerate apartheid and we overcame that, we do not tolerate corruption, and we shall overcome that as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raymond. At the beginning of this webinar, I mentioned that Paddy was a person who epitomized the idea of words and deeds being in harmony, that there was no division between his words and his actions. And I'm really pleased to see how you have actually presented that in fact is exactly Paddy Kearney. His transparent life was just something that we all really admired. I would just like to bring up four little points before we go into the discussion, and to say that so far what we've looked at is the need, and if we look at the chat as well from the Facebook chat, there's a growing and a loud call for accountability and consequences, that people who are stealing from the poor need to really face consequences. We've heard that in many different ways. We've also heard that it's really important to begin to repair the damage caused by corruption, and to deal with the wall, even as we are waiting for accountability and consequences. We've heard how important it is to reach out not only to each other, but to those who actually need to hear this message, and to reach out to them at a local, provincial, national, and international level. that the voices of the ordinary person needs to also be heard. And finally, the last point I want to just bring up is that the importance of creating an environment to help people make the right choices. So in summary, I would say um, those are some of the points that I have picked up. We will now open up for a discussion and questions. You can use the chat facility on Zoom, or you can, and the Q&A facility on Zoom. You can also use the Facebook facility. But if you would like to actually speak, please raise your hands and we will unmute you, and you can then ask your question directly. I don't see any hands raised from Selvin. There aren't any hands raised in the Zoom.
Regrettably, not as yet. But I
Okay,
suppose
so we'll go to one of the questions that were raised in the Facebook chat then directly. This question was addressed to you, Father Smangeliso Makachwa. It's from Kanya Kumari Padyachi. She asks, Father Smangeliso, would you agree that correcting behavior and attitude through such initiatives as the Moral Regeneration Movement or other school-based value programs are less likely to succeed than if we engage children in a moral and ethical value system in the early preschool years? Although it must be said that these initiatives are not mutually exclusive. I think what she's talking about, what she's asking is, should we not also be addressing children in their early childhood? The point that was raised early on about early childhood development. Father Makachwa, this question was addressed to you. I hope we have the technical glitches sorted so that you can seamlessly address it. Father, we see you, but we don't hear you. Now we don't see you either. Okay, there we go. Father?
There was a resolution that was taken by the at the ANC annual conferences 4 or 5 years ago, to the effect that this booklet called the Charter of Positive Values should be included in the curriculum of basic education, so that children, right from their very young tender school going age, that they're actually exposed to these values that are listed here. I assume many of you probably are au fait with the contents of this. Just for me to say that there are 9 of them, and none of these values is really talking about heaven, I mean, the afterlife and so on, is addressing concrete issues of living men and women. It moves from the premise that you cannot talk ethics or morality to people who are grossly maltreated, who are unemployed, who are hungry, people who are victims of corruption, and people whose level of education leaves much to be desired, and so on. So you can't really go and talk ethics about them without addressing their real issues. So what we then do as Moral Regeneration Movement is to have programs, social dialogue with people in institutions of higher learning, in school, especially in ordinary communities. That's what we do, and that is our approach. And we therefore feel that even in an issue such as this one, that corruption, we need to encourage people to meet regularly, but also to do a little bit of social analysis so that they understand the root causes of the problem before they even act. Now, understanding the problem also means that the statistical evidence, for example, that has been given to us, anecdotal evidence that we have in abundance and so, should also become a very important ingredient in all such or movements if they are to be successful.
Thank you so much, Father, for that. For that, I hope that the speakers are those who ask the questions are satisfied with that. I'm sure we can continue this discussion further. There's another question I think that's posed to all participants, that how do we and it goes to how do we translate our conversation and our words into action? How do we move from words to actual deeds? How do we engage society? How do we engage people? And what do we actually do going from here? I also would like to welcome the rest of the speakers to comment on each other's presentations. Mashudu, Juanita, Brother Raymond, all of you, I would welcome you to engage with each other while we're waiting for other questions. So please feel free. I can also pose something to particularly perhaps Juanita and Mashudu. There's an interesting conversation that's currently taking place in the field of international criminal law, where the question is being asked, and particularly within the context of COVID corruption. I think, Juanita, while a lot of us have sympathy and empathy and really appreciate, your emphasis on the dark and light in human beings and the choices that we have to make. I think that the outrage that people are feeling, particularly in South Africa, but I understand that this is prevalent in other parts of Africa as well, where you have COVID-related corruption around PPE and, around relief packages, and that money that was actually meant to alleviate the situation of poor people, to actually protect healthcare workers and protect people, has been pocketed. And so in the international criminal law sector, there's a question that's being asked as to whether this form of corruption doesn't actually constitute a crime against humanity, and whether or not the Rome Statute, the international criminal law, should be invoked now to address COVID-related corruption specifically. So, really serious consequences, a really serious approach to it, where the whole of government comes to bear, and international criminal law comes to the fore to actually address this form of corruption. I'm not sure if you want to go first, Juanita or Mashudu.
Steps.
You decide.
Juanita, you go first.
Thanks. I don't want to impose. I think every act of corruption, big or small, in any context, COVID or not, is a violation of a human right, collective and individual. So in any circumstance, I would say corruption causes human rights violations. And I share and see, of course, the outrage of corruption in the context of the pandemic and the measures that need to be taken against it, and the quest to save lives and to protect people in all of its dimensions. So, and I do think, if you had asked me this question before the pandemic, I would have said, I think there is anyway, if one would like to argue it legally. Anyway, corruption is an issue that the International Court of Justice could deal with, because I do see the direct connection between corruption and human rights. So to answer your question directly, I would say, of course, yes, I see a case. The argument could be made. And I wish it was made by someone. So we entered this discussion with the court, and we consider that. Right now, there have been initiatives to be discussed next year in the UN, in the UNGAS, the General Assembly of the United Nations, to consider the creation of an international court against corruption. I think in that case, the idea is not so good, because I don't think in that case it's really solving a problem. It's creating another entity, using a lot of resources to actually address an issue that's not the problem. I don't think creating a new court will make the planet better. But using existing mechanisms, and particularly existing human rights mechanisms and human rights litigation to address these problems and to address the consequences of corruption, is definitely a good idea. And it's a good idea worth trying, not only with the international court, but also with the regional courts and with the national courts as well. I wouldn't discard the idea.
Mashudu, do you want to add?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Juanita makes an excellent point. You know, any form of corruption is a human rights violation, and it's interesting because when you look at corporate corruption or private sector corruption, it's been very difficult to try and motivate why corruption is a human rights issue and not just a corruption on its own. I think now when we're looking at the pandemic and we're looking at corruption of PPEs, and it being rightly defined as a causing death, and it being the corruption of the PPEs causing death, you're looking at the right to life as a preemptory norm. In international law, there's a concept called ius cogens. It's a fundamental principle in international law that's accepted by the international community as a principle which should not at any point be interfered with. And that's something that you could easily raise in your international courts. And if we look at the pandemic holistically and from a South African perspective, not only is there an issue of corruption with the PPEs and the tender process, but there's corruption in your basic access to services that has been happening and exacerbated now through the pandemic. And that's a violation of a number of rights that are under your civil and political covenants. So it's very easy for well, it's an option that can be taken. And I think what we've seen from a Corruption Watch perspective, as a Transparency International chapter, a lot of the loans, your international loans that have been approved, have certain corruption, let me say, provisions, where, for example, the IMF loan requested the South African government to include beneficial ownership provisions to ensure that there is some kind of tracking and an acknowledgement of who is the final owner or benefactor of the funds that eventually goes to the country. So you're seeing a lot of your World Banks and your finances and your kind of your private sector industries or international standard setting bodies that are looking at corruption very seriously in South Africa and ensuring that there's provisions that the country needs to adhere to in order for them to gain access to those funds. So it's definitely the international platform is there to be explored, specifically in terms of gaining accountability and ensuring that the money is used exactly for what it was required for.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mashudu. I don't want to put you on the spot, Jamasina, but since you are with us, would you like to add your views about corruption within the international human rights field? Jamasina, are you there? Jamasina King is a commissioner of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights and is here with us. I see her as a participant, but I'm not sure if she's actually with us. Jamasina, are you there? Okay. No. Yes, you need to be unmuted if you're going to.
Asha, I'm trying
yes,
to.
I am with you. Oh, sorry.
Okay,
I am
great.
with you, Aisha. But My internet is very
Oh, okay, okay. I was just asking if you would like to contribute to this conversation about corruption as a human rights issue from your perspective as a commissioner of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. I think your internet is.
Certainly it is a human rights issue which we have said over and over again, because when we talk about issues of economic, social, and cultural rights, yeah, it's bad, but it's certainly a human rights issue. The right to education, the right to health, and all of these other rights, water, sanitation, and everything.
Are all compromised, yes. Okay, so thank you so much, Jamasina. I wish that we could hear more from you, but let's move on to, there are lots of comments in the chat, and both chats, the Zoom chat and the Facebook chat, relating to early childhood strategies around integrating these kinds of ethics and values in early childhood education and development. And also, Haj Wahed has said that Father Mukachwa has also posed some practical solutions about, and he says, what about respected organizations establishing a set of goals and criteria to rate all politicians annually? In other words, to give them like a grade, a bit like what the Mail and Guardian does around ethics, community work, etc., so that if politicians are rated 1 out of 10 for competency or ethics, then that person should never be placed in any position of leadership without citizen outrage and negative media coverage. He's talking about, so there's two issues that have come out from the chat. One is around early childhood development and ethical teaching of ethics in early childhood development programs. And the other suggestion relates to this grading of politicians and, I suppose, government officials and bureaucrats. Anybody who would like to comment on that? Prof. Sudin, perhaps?
So let's thanks very much, Asham. So I'll talk about this grading of institutions. I think that's a very provocative idea. How you would do that, I think, would be a little bit of a challenge. So thinking as a bureaucrat myself, and these reports that we have to make to our principals, we regularly have governance instruments inside of them, but they're very complicated. And so to be developing, and so I'd like to think about this. So to be developing a governance instrument which easily and accurately and verifiably gets you to do this, I think we would need to think about. I'm saying that simply in light of the comment that I made earlier about the small number of cases of guilty findings that we have against some of our public servants. And so while that number is modest, I suggested that the problem was significantly greater. So we clearly in our reporting instruments are not able to actually get at the problem. So I'm saying that I think we need to think about how we would do that in ways which get beyond the ways in which individuals are able to disguise and to hide, what is going on. Thanks.
Ashat, I think that the webinar will close up in 2 minutes.
Yes,
So
yes, I was going to ask you to just close, please. Yes, yes.
Yeah. So thank you so much, firstly to Selvin for his technical assistance and managing the Zoom platform. Thank you again to Alex, to Lindiwe for assisting with the sign language. I hope it was successful. Thank you also to Kiru for helping with the question and the discussion. Thank you to Kidar for assisting with the video. All the guest speakers, Father Raymond, Father Smangaliso Makechwa, Juanita Mashudu, Professor Sudin, and Katrada Foundation. I know that we have a lot of work to do together, Katrada Foundation, Sean Bolton. But thank you so much for coming to this webinar and sharing your expertise. And finally, we are grateful to all of you who participated in this webinar. This is only the beginning. This is part of a wider call to action. We hope to see you all again. In the meantime, take care, be safe, God bless. Thank you.
If we can just unmute and give if we can just unmute ourselves at least and give the panelists and all of everyone a round of applause. Thank you very much to everyone.
A screenshot.